Christmas Eve. A private plane. Everything is ready for takeoff. But then amidst the quiet cabin, a voice rang out. "You can't sit here. Change seats." The black woman didn't scream. She didn't react violently. She simply stood up quietly, and the entire airplane cabin fell silent. If it were you, what would you do? Will you remain silent to ensure a peaceful flight, or will you speak up knowing that even a single word could cause things to spiral out of control? No one on the plane knew that. That woman was the Philo, owner of the aircraft. And no one could have imagined that her small decision that night would bring down a power system that had existed for decades. This story isn't just about discrimination. It's about the moment when people are forced to choose between silence and self-respect, between immediate safety and long-term righteousness. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had to break your promise to keep the peace, then this story might be your story. Stay and listen to the entire journey. And if you feel you're somewhere in this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to begin with us. It snowed very lightly. It wasn't the kind of heavy snow that would cause chaos, but a light, slow-falling snow enough to illuminate the pavement under the soft yellow lights of Hudson Executive Airfield, a private airport. Christmas Eve. Nearly 11 o'clock. The air was so quiet you could hear the wind whistling through the metal railings at the edge of the runway. The Falcon X-900 sat silently at the end of the tarmac, its silver-white fuselage reflecting the cold light. There were no noisy passengers, no children running around, only the smell of fuel, the cold metal, and the very familiar feeling of private night flights. In the passenger cabin, Avery Johnson was seated in seat 1A. She sat up straight, her hands resting neatly on her lap. Her dark brown wool coat was neatly folded beside her. Her black leather shoes were slightly wet from the snow, but she had wiped them clean with a tissue before boarding the plane. No jewelry, no designer handbag. Just a simple old leather bag placed neatly under the seat in front of her. Avery was familiar with airplane cabins like this. She'd flown hundreds of flights in the past 10 years. But tonight felt different. Perhaps it was because of Christmas, or because of the unusually prolonged silence. She had just unbuckled her seatbelt when footsteps echoed from the front of the cockpit. Heavy, solid, definitely. A man in a pilot's uniform stepped out, white shirt with 4 stripes on the shoulders, tall and broad-shouldered. His graying hair was neatly combed, a familiar style of men accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. He stopped in the middle of the aisle. He looked directly at Avery. The glance wasn't long, but it was enough to scan from head to toe. Enough to draw a conclusion, enough to make a decision. Then he spoke. The voice wasn't loud, but it was cold and very clear. "Move." Avery looked up. He pointed towards the chair where she was sitting. "That seat isn't for you." There was no one else in the airplane cabin, no witnesses, no noise to drown out the statement. It fell naked like an unexplained command. Avery didn't get up right away. She looked at the man in front of her, then down at the chair, then back at him. Her gaze held no anger, no fear, just a very brief moment of assessment. As if she were asking herself, this kind of thing again. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was calm. The pilot let out a sigh, clearly showing impatience. "This seat is for the main passenger. You need to move to the back." Avery looked around the compartment. 6 seats, all empty. "The flight list only had 1 passenger," she said. "And that name was mine." He smirked, a half smile. "Manifestations don't always reflect reality," he replied. "There are things you don't need to know." The weather changed. It's not about the words themselves, but about how they're spoken. The way a person is used to having others obey them. Avery realized this very quickly. She'd encountered this type of person all her life. She stood up, not in a hurry, not resisting, just standing up. "So where should I sit?" she asked. The pilot pointed to the back, near the restrooms, where there was a small folding chair for the flight attendants during takeoff and landing. There. Avery looked in the direction he pointed. A small, narrow folding seat against the wall. No window, no space, not a seat for a passenger on an overnight flight. She turned to look at him. "Why?" she asked. The pilot folded his arms. "Security. Just one word, but it's used as a wall to block out all questions." Avery was silent for a few seconds. Familiar thoughts flooded her mind. Old memories. Times she'd been asked. Are you sure you're in the right place? Times people's gazes at her card longer than necessary. She learned that the first reaction is often the worst. Okay, she said. But before I move, I want to confirm one thing. The pilot raised his eyebrows. Confirmation of what my name, Avery said. It's on the manifest. He turned away, muttered something, and walked toward the cockpit. Avery stood still. She didn't sit down. But she didn't walk away either. She waited. The airplane cabin was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning was louder than usual. 1 minute has passed. Then, 2 minutes. The pilot turned around. An iPad was in his hand. He glanced at the screen, then looked at Avery, then looked at the screen again. Johnson, he said. That name is on the list. He looked up, but that doesn't mean she gets to choose her seat. Then, he said something that he would probably wish he had never said in his lifetime. She should know her place. There was no background music, no loud noises, just a single sentence hanging suspended in the confined space of the airplane cabin. Avery inhaled slowly. She looked him straight in the eye. My place, she said, is on this flight. Then she walked towards the folding chair. It wasn't because she believed she was wrong. It was because she knew that some stories can only be told when others have talked about them too much. The plane hasn't taken off yet, and Christmas has only just begun. Avery Johnson sat down on the folding chair near the toilet. The small hard seat was mounted flush against the wall. When she pulled it down, the metal hinges made a dry, clicking sound. The sound echoed in the quiet airplane cabin louder than it should have been. She fastened her seatbelt. It was a little short. She had to pull a bit harder to get it to engage. Avery was used to sitting in places that weren't designed for him. It wasn't because she lacked options. Rather, her whole life from a very young age had taught her one thing, that sometimes to see the true face of a person or a system you have to accept standing at the lowest position in the room. She leaned her head gently against the wall. Not because she was tired, but because she needed a second to breathe. Outside, it's still snowing. In the cockpit, Captain Mark Holloway was talking to someone through a headset. His voice was deep, firm, and authoritative. The kind of voice Avery had heard countless times in her life. The voice of men who believed the world was set up to serve them. Avery gently closed her eyes. The first image that came to her mind wasn't the scene she had just witnessed. It was a small room from over 20 years ago. Avery was 11 years old at the time. Little Avery stood in the principal's office at her elementary school in Southside Chicago. Her mother sat beside her, her hands resting on her lap, clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The principal, a middle-aged white man, glanced at the student files on his desk before looking up. We think this advanced program might be too much for Avery, he said. Avery still remembers the feeling vividly. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was the familiar feeling of being placed in a box you didn't choose. Her mother didn't say anything right away. She just asked one question. What is he basing this on? The headmaster hesitated. Then he said something Avery had heard over and over again her whole life. Statistical. That statistic followed Avery throughout the following years. When she went to college, when she applied for jobs, when she walked into a boardroom as the only one who wasn't like the rest, Avery learned not to react immediately. Not because she was weak, but because she understood that emotional reactions often made it easier for others to ignore you. She opened her eyes. Emily Ross, the flight attendant, was standing at the back of the cabin, pretending to rearrange the overhead compartments even though there was nothing to rearrange. Emily avoided Avery's gaze. Not out of malice, but out of fear. Avery realized that. She didn't blame him. Everyone has moments of silence for fear of losing their job. Avery was one of them long before she had a choice. She looked down at her hands. Those hands had trembled when she signed her first contract. They had trembled when she put pen to paper to fire someone she valued. They had trembled when she realized she had become the person she never dared to dream of being. Avery Johnson, CEO, Quinn North Meridian Holdings. She built her logistics and supply chain technology company from scratch. No family funds, no backing. Just sleepless nights and an unwavering belief that she has the right to exist in any environment. She never boasted about it. Not out of modesty, but because she knew that titles don't protect you from prejudice. Sometimes they even make things worse. Avery deliberately chose to dress simply for this flight. Not to test anyone. Not to prove anything. simply because she was tired. She was tired of always having to mentally prepare herself to represent an entire group of people. Tired of feeling scrutinized, judged, and compared every time she entered a luxurious space. She wanted to be herself on Christmas Eve. A woman who wanted to go home after a long year. But the world doesn't always allow that. Captain Holloway stepped out of the cockpit again. He walked past Avery without looking at her, as if she were part of the interior. A fixed object. We're going to push the takeoff date back 15 minutes, he told Emily. There are a few issues to deal with. Emily nodded in agreement. Avery heard every word clearly. She knew what the problem was, or rather who it was. She wondered if things would have been different tonight if she weren't Avery Johnson. If she'd worn a more expensive dress. If she'd had a white man with her. If she'd spoken louder from the start. Then she stopped. She didn't like that question, because it always places the blame on the person who is treated unfairly instead of placing it on the system that created the injustice. Avery sat up straighter, not out of anger, but because she had made a decision a long time ago. She will not explain her existence to anyone. If Captain Holloway wanted to make a big deal out of this, she would let him see it through to the end. Let everything be revealed layer by layer. No cover-ups. No rush. She looked at her watch. It was almost 11:30. In Chicago, her mother was probably sitting by the window watching the snow fall, waiting for a call. Avery had promised to call when the plane took off. She wasn't sure she could keep that promise on time, but she knew one thing. Tonight will not end like any other night. And it wasn't because she wanted it that way, because there are people who, when given a little power, will push themselves to the very edge. Avery sat still. Her breathing was even. Her eyes were calm. She waited. Hudson Executive Airfield at night looks like a painting created with cool tones. High-powered lights shone down on the concrete surface, covered with a thin layer of snow, creating dappled patches of light. A breeze swept through the small station, carrying the scent of metal and jet fuel. The space often evoked a sense of privacy and seclusion reserved for those accustomed to not having to cue or explain their identity. But for Avery Johnson, this place never truly belonged to her. It wasn't because she didn't have the right to be there. It was because she always sensed something that many people didn't realize, that certain spaces are designed to welcome specific types of people. And when you don't fit that mold, you'll always be reminded, even if it's just by a glance. Before boarding, Avery walked a short distance from the waiting area to the tarmac. There was no private shuttle. No friendly greeting. The employee at the counter only glanced at her briefly before looking down at their computer screen. The plane is at the far end of the tarmac, he said, his voice even. You can walk out on your own. Avery nodded. She was used to going by herself. As she walked across the slippery wet ground, she noticed the eyes of several people standing nearby. A group of technicians, a security guard. No one said anything, but the gazes were there, glancing over, stopping, then moving on, as if they were trying to categorize her in some way that would be easier to understand. Is it a passenger, or an assistant, or a service staff member? Those questions were never spoken aloud, but Avery had heard them all her life in one way or another. Now, sitting in that cramped folding seat in the airplane cabin, that feeling returns. Not a feeling of being insulted, rather a feeling of being subtly excluded. She heard the hatch close, a heavy, decisive thump. That sound usually brought a sense of security. But tonight it made Avery realize she was in a confined space where Captain Mark Holloway's power was absolute. Emily Ross walked past her, a stack of papers in her hand. The young woman quickened her pace as if trying to avoid any prolonged interaction. As she passed, Emily glanced briefly at Avery, her eyes showing some hesitation, then quickly turned away. Avery understands. Emily isn't a bad person. She's just a small link in a larger system. A system where asking questions can cost you your job faster than making a mistake. In the cockpit, Captain Holloway was checking the pre-flight parameters. His voice, transmitted through the internal systems, was steady, cold, and confident. He spoke of wind pressure and altitude. The numbers were precise to the nearest unit of measurement according to U.S. standards. Everything was correct. Everything was according to procedure. There's only one thing that's not part of the process. Avery Johnson. She didn't fit the image he had in his head of a passenger on this flight. And so her existence became a problem that needed to be addressed. Avery looked out the small window near the folding chair. The snow was falling more slowly. The snowflakes swirled in the lamplight, then melted as they touched the ground. The sight reminded her of another evening many years ago. That day, Avery had just been invited to give a presentation to the board of directors of a large corporation. She walked into the meeting room in a simple suit, carrying the plan she had prepared for 3 months. When she began to speak, a man at the head of the table interrupted her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite but cold. "Are you an assistant or a presenter?" The room fell silent. A few people smiled awkwardly. No one spoke. How did Avery respond? She remembers smiling, gently, then speaking clearly. "I am the CEO." The room was as silent that day as this airplane cabin. That silence always carries the same feeling. It's not noisy, not dramatic, but it's heavy, and it forces the person caught in it to choose: either bow their head and let it pass, or stand firm and accept the price of displeasing others. Avery chose to stand firm. Many times, and each time the price was higher. She opened her phone and checked the signal. No signal. That wasn't surprising. But it made her realize that in this moment she was almost completely cut off from the outside world. No emails. No calls. No legal team, just a button away. It's just her. And those are the ones deciding how she's treated. Captain Holloway stepped out of the cockpit again. This time he stopped near where Avery was sitting. He didn't look at her, but he spoke loud enough for her to hear. "We need to keep the compartment clean," he said, as if speaking to thin air. "There are certain standards." Avery looked up. "Standards for whom?" she asked. He turned around, his eyes showing displeasure. "For the passengers," he replied. "Those who pay the real money." Avery didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just nodded slightly. "Then you should double-check the list," she said. "Really?" Captain Holloway smirked. "I know what I'm doing," he said. "And I know who's who." The words rang out firm and unwavering, like an unproven assertion. Avery felt a chill run down her spine, not from fear, but because she realized quite clearly that he had put himself in a dangerous position. Those who always believe they know who's who are often the ones who rarely check their assumptions. Avery turned away, not because she had lost, but because she didn't need to win this conversation. She just needed time. Time is of the essence for things to unfold as they truly are. The plane hadn't yet taken off. The clock on the cabin wall showed 11:45. Christmas was fast approaching, and with it a truth that no one in this cabin, except Avery, seemed ready to face. She took a deep breath. She didn't belong in this folding chair. But if necessary, she could sit here longer than anyone else, because she knew that some battles weren't decided by where you sat, but by how patient you were. And tonight, Avery Johnson has a lot of patience. Captain Mark Holloway always believed he understood the sky very well. 30 years of flying, over 15,000 hours in the cockpit, hundreds of transcontinental flights. Those numbers weren't just achievements. They were like an invisible shield he carried with him. They made him believe that in any aircraft cabin his word was law, and it's the same tonight. Holloway stood in the cockpit, looking through the windshield at the snow-covered runway. He liked this moment. The moment before the plane took off, when everything was under control, when no one asked questions, when the world was silent and waiting for his orders. But that silence was broken. It wasn't because of the weather. It wasn't because of the technique. It was because of a woman sitting behind him in a position where, in his view, she shouldn't be. Holloway turned his seat around and stepped out of the cockpit again. Each step he took was firm. He wanted to assert his presence, to remind everyone who was in charge here. His gaze swept over Emily Ross, then settled on Avery Johnson. Avery remained seated in the folding chair, back straight, hands resting lightly on her thighs. No phone, no book, no sign of restlessness. This calmness, strangely enough, irritated Holloway more than any resistance. "You seem very calm," he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. Avery looked up. "What should I do?" she asked. Holloway smirked. "Worried," he replied. "Or, at least cooperative." "I'm cooperating," Avery said. "I've moved." "But she still asks questions," Holloway said, his voice hardening. "And I don't like that." "That's true." Holloway wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to giving orders. And for most of his life, his orders were always obeyed without explanation. Avery looked at him for a long time. No challenge, no bowing, just looking as if she were trying to understand what it was about this man that made him believe he had the right to determine the value of others. Did you know, she said slowly, that people who are convinced they are always right often don't realize when they are wrong. Holloway laughed loudly, a short, dry laugh devoid of any humor. Are you teaching me how to do the job? He asked. I've been flying planes since you were still in high school. Avery didn't argue. She'd heard it many times, in many different forms, from men who believed that experience automatically equated to integrity. I'm not teaching, she said. I'm just reminding them. Holloway took another step closer, standing so near that Avery could smell the strong coffee scent on his shirt. He spoke more softly, but his tone was sharper. You need to understand one thing, he said. On this plane, I'm the one who decides. Not a business card. Not a name on paper. It's me. Avery felt Emily Ross's gaze from behind. The young woman stood still, her hands gripping the tray tightly, clearly uncomfortable. Daniel Brooks, the co-pilot, poked his head out of the cockpit, then pulled it back in, as if not yet ready to join the conversation. A familiar system is at work. Those in power speak. Others remain silent, not because they agree, but because they are afraid. Avery took a deep breath. Then you should be very careful with your decisions, she said, because power does not exempt you from responsibility. Holloway widened his eyes. Are you threatening me? No, Avery replied. I'm warning you. In that moment, something changed in Holloway's eyes. Not fear, but anger. An anger that stemmed from feeling challenged by someone he considered unqualified to do it. That's enough, he said, turning to Emily. Call security. Emily was stunned. Captain. Captain, she asked, her voice low. Call airport security, Holloway repeated. This passenger is disrupting operations. Avery looked at Emily. Her gaze wasn't reproachful, just calm, as if she understood the difficult choice the young woman was facing. Emily swallowed, then turned away and pressed the button on her walkie-talkie. The air in the cabin grew thick. The hum of the air conditioning grew louder. Holloway's footsteps echoed as he turned toward the cockpit, as if everything had been settled. Avery remained seated. She didn't stand up. She didn't protest. She didn't plead. She just sat there silently, like someone who had foreseen the outcome. In her mind, conflicting thoughts swirled. Not fear, but consideration. She knew calling security would only escalate things. There would be reports. There would be questions. There would be curious stares. She could stop it now with just one word, one title, one phone call. But she didn't do it. Because there are times when exposing the truth is more important than protecting one's own comfort. She thought of those who had once been in her position. No name recognition, no legal team, no chance of being heard. If she spoke up too soon tonight, this story would be nothing more than a minor misunderstanding. An incident resolved in silence. But if she waited a little longer, Avery heard footsteps outside the plane. Heavy, decisive. Airport security was coming. Holloway turned around, his eyes gleaming with a cold satisfaction, as if he had just proven something. I gave her a chance, he said. She didn't know it. Avery looked at him, her voice as soft as the wind. He feels the same way, she said. A knock came from the compartment door. 3 knocks. Short, clear. Holloway adjusted his coat, walked toward the door, ready to tell his story. The story he was used to telling. The story in which he was the one maintaining order. And the woman sitting in the folding chair was just a nuisance to be gotten rid of. Avery sat still, her hands clasped together. She knew that from this moment on things could never go back to how they were. The compartment door opened. A blast of cold air swept in from outside, carrying the scent of damp snow and a gentle whistling sound. 2 airport security officers stepped forward. They wore thick coats, their hats pulled low, and their faces were serious. One held a notebook, the other placed his hand near a walkie-talkie. Captain Mark Holloway stepped forward, confident and decisive, as if he were accustomed to situations like this. Thank you for arriving quickly, he said. We have a disruptive passenger. Avery Johnson looked up. She gazed at the scene before her with a calmness that surprised even herself. Perhaps it was because deep down she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. One of the 2 security guards looked in the direction Holloway pointed. His gaze lingered on Avery for a moment. Then he glanced down at the folding chair, then back at Holloway. What happened, Captain? He asked. Holloway sighed as if dealing with an unnecessary nuisance. This passenger refused to follow instructions, he said. She insisted on sitting in a seat that wasn't meant for her. She disrupted the flight preparation process. Avery listened to every word. There were no swear words, no offensive remarks. But the way the words were phrased, the choice of words was enough to paint a picture of an unpleasant, uncooperative woman who didn't understand the law. She stood up. It wasn't because she was asked to. It was because she didn't want to continue being talked about as if she wasn't even there. I wasn't causing trouble, Avery said. Her voice was clear, not shaky. I was just asking why I was being asked to leave the seat I was assigned. The security guard turned to Holloway. Is her name on the manifest? He asked. Holloway answered immediately without hesitation. Yes, he said, but that's the seat for the main passenger. She's not. The words hung in the air. Avery felt Emily Ross's gaze from behind. The young woman stood still, clutching the tray tightly like a life raft. So, who is the main passenger? The security officer continued to ask. Holloway paused slightly, just for a very brief moment, but enough for Avery to notice. Internal information, he replied. No explanation is necessary. The security guard frowned, but he didn't object. He turned to Avery. Madam, he said, his voice neutral. We need your cooperation. If the captain requests a change of seats, you should comply. Avery nodded. I did, as he said, she said. I'm sitting in the chair he pointed to. But she still objected, Holloway interjected. And I can't take off with an unstable passenger. Unstable. It fell from their light but sharp. Avery felt something tighten in her chest. Not anger, but a familiar sadness. Sadness because she had heard this word in other contexts. In meetings, in reports, in whispers behind her back. When a black woman doesn't stay silent, she's often labeled as unstable. She looked directly at Holloway. What are you talking about? She asked. What did I do to deserve being called that? Holloway mouthwater. Her attitude, he said. The way she looked, the way she spoke. She made the crew uncomfortable. Emily bowed her head. Daniel Brooks hadn't yet stepped out of the cockpit. He was there listening to everything, but not yet ready to cross his safety line. Avery inhaled slowly. Do you know? She said that your feeling of discomfort is not a measure of my behavior. Holloway laughed. Are you arguing semantically with me? He asked. I'm responsible for safety here. And I'm saying you're the risk. The security guard glanced back and forth between the two men. The atmosphere was tense. But what made Avery realize things had gone too far was Holloway's gaze. It was no longer just confidence. It was blatant contempt. Listen, Holloway said, his voice lower and slower as if speaking to a child. I don't know who you know. I don't know who you think you are. But this isn't the place to prove it. You should be grateful you're still on this flight. Avery felt as if the room had shrunk. Gratitude, she asked softly. That's right, Holloway said. There are people who will never get this opportunity. That statement more than anything else sent a chill down Avery's spine. Not because it was offensive, but because it accurately reflected a deeply ingrained mindset that her presence here was a privilege, not a right. The security guard coughed lightly. Captain, he said, unless there is violence or refusal to comply, we usually don't. She's causing a disturbance. Holloway interrupted, and I asked her to leave the plane. This time, no beating around the bush. Avery turned to the security guard. Can you tell me, she asked, which clause I violated? He hesitated. Madam, we are only following the crew's instructions. Avery nodded, a very slight nod. Then, give me a few minutes, she said. I need to make a phone call. Holloway shook his head immediately. No, he said. There were no calls. We're done here. You have no right to stop me from making the call, Avery replied. We're still on the ground. Holloway took a step forward. You're testing my patience, he said, and I don't have much left. Avery looked at him, her gaze no longer gentle as before. Not angry, but firmer. Then you should stop, she said. Right now. A moment of silence ensued. Holloway turned to the security officer. Bring her down, he said. If necessary, use coercive measures. Emily let out a soft sigh, a very faint sound. But Avery heard it. The security guard looked at Avery, then at Holloway. Finally, he walked towards Avery. Madam, he said, his voice lowering. Please cooperate. Avery did not back down. She stood tall. Her shoulders were square. Her gaze was calm. Okay, she said, but I want to say one thing. Holloway crossed his arms, his face showing defiance. Go ahead and say it, he replied. But that won't change the outcome. Avery looked around the airplane cabin. She looked at Emily. She looked at the cabin door. She looked at the expensive details of a space designed to exclude people like her. Then she spoke, her voice clear enough for everyone to hear. What's happening here, she said, isn't about security. It's about power. And he's abusing it. Holloway gave a wry smile. Are you finished speaking? Avery nodded. Done. The security officer took another step forward, and at that moment Avery Johnson understood that from then on, it would no longer be a small misunderstanding. It had become a story that many people out there have lived through in different ways, and that story has only just begun. Avery Johnson stood still in the middle of the airplane cabin. The two security guards moved closer. They didn't touch her, but the distance was close enough for her to feel the pressure. Not physical pressure, the pressure of being forced to make a choice. She can end this now. Just say one sentence, one name, one title. Just pull out your phone and call the right person. Everything will stop. Holloway will back down. Security will apologize. The report will be rewritten in softer words. Avery knew that. She always knew. But because of that, a familiar question popped into her head. A question that had haunted her for years in many different versions. If I stop here, how many other people will have to suffer this after me? She recalled the first time that question had come up. That was the day Avery decided not to remain silent at a board meeting. An investor had said her idea was too ambitious and unrealistic, even though that very idea had helped her company double in size in just 2 years. She could have smiled, nodded, and let it go. But she didn't. She spoke out. Calmly. Clearly. Without personal attacks. Just stating the truth. And what is the price? Unanswered calls. Ignored emails. Whispers that she was difficult to work with. But in return, she retained something far more important, the feeling that she hadn't betrayed herself. Tonight that feeling has returned. Avery looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking, but she could feel her heartbeat slowing. When things got tense, her body always reacted like this. Slow down, focus more, be clearer. She looked over at Emily Ross. Emily stood to one side, her gaze wavering. The young woman looked smaller than usual. Her shoulders hunched slightly, as if she wanted to disappear from the space. Avery recognized the fear in her eyes. The familiar fear of those with few choices. Then she thought of Daniel Brooks. The co-pilot was still in the cockpit. Avery knew he was listening. He knew he misunderstood, but understanding didn't mean acting. Not everyone was safe enough to speak up. Avery wondered what Daniel would learn if she withdrew now. What Emily would learn. What others, those in weaker positions than her, would learn. That silence is the only way to survive. She didn't want that lesson to be learned. Captain Mark Holloway stood a few steps away from her, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was cold, tinged with annoyance that things weren't over as quickly as he'd like. You're wasting everyone's time, he said. We have a schedule. Avery looked up at him. Is he afraid of missing his flight, she said slowly, or is he afraid of losing control? Holloway froze for a very brief moment. But it was enough for Avery to realize she had hit the right spot. You have no right to judge me, he replied. You're just a passenger. Avery nodded slightly. Yes, she said. Tonight, I'm just a passenger. The statement sounded ordinary at first glance. But Holloway sensed something was wrong. It was as if she had just revealed a deeper, more nuanced meaning that he hadn't yet grasped. One of the two security guards spoke up, his voice less harsh than before. Madam, he said, we just want to get this over with quickly. If you cooperate and leave the plane, things will be simpler. Avery turned to him. I understand, she said. And I don't blame you. He was surprised. Perhaps he wasn't used to being spoken to like that in such a tense situation. But Avery continued, have you ever wondered why situations like this always fall into the hands of people like me? He didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how to answer. Avery turned to look at Holloway. He thinks he's keeping the flight safe, she said. But in reality, he's protecting his own sense of power. Holloway let out a dry, hollow laugh. Do you think you understand me? No, Avery replied. I just understand the system. I've lived in it my whole life. A moment of silence ensued. No one spoke, but in Avery's mind the conversation continued. Who am I doing this for? Am I being too stubborn? Do I have the right to drag everyone else into this? Those questions weren't pleasant, but Avery didn't shy away from them. She confronted them as she always did. She remembered her mother, the woman who had taught her that there are battles you don't need to win immediately. But there are also battles that if you don't step into them, you'll regret for the rest of your life. Christmas Eve, an airplane cabin, an order that should not have been spoken. Avery knew that if she got off the plane in silence tonight, she would continue flying. She would get back to Chicago. She would have dinner with her mother. Everything would be all right. But each time afterward, when she heard a similar story on the news, when she saw another black woman being called annoying, unstable, unreasonable, she would remember this moment and wonder she had the chance to change something and didn't. She didn't want to carry that question over. Avery took a deep breath. Then he exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said, turning to the security guard. "I'll go." Holloway flashed a fleeting smile, a smile of someone who believed they had just won. But Avery raised her hand, signaling to wait. "But before I get out," she said, "I want to ask one thing. It's perfectly legal." Holloway frowned. "What else?" he asked. "I want you," she said, looking directly at a security officer, "to record everything that happened tonight. Every word spoken, every decision made." He nodded, though he seemed a little confused. "And I want you," Avery turned to Holloway, "to confirm verbally that you asked me to leave the plane because you considered me a security risk." Holloway paused. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I just want everything to be clear," Avery said. "For all of us." Another moment of silence. Finally, Holloway nodded. "Yes," he said. "I believe you pose a security risk." Avery nodded in return. "Thank you," she said. Then she turned and walked towards the compartment door. Each step was slow and steady. She didn't look like someone being escorted, but rather like someone actively stepping into a new chapter of the story. She stopped right at the doorway. A cold wind blew in. Snow was falling lightly. Avery turned around, taking one last look at the airplane cabin. "You should hope," she said to Holloway, her voice very soft, "that what you believe to be true is indeed true." Then she got out. The door closed behind them. But the story isn't there yet. The air outside the runway is freezing cold. The wind lashed against Avery Johnson's face as she descended the metal steps of the Falcon X-900. Snow crunched under her shoes. The airport lights shone down, making everything seem both clear and distant. She pulled her coat tighter, not because of the cold, but because of the familiar emptiness of standing alone in an unwelcoming space. Two security guards walked behind her. The distance was just right for monitoring, but not too close. They didn't touch her. Not yet. At least not at this moment. "We'll go back to the station," someone said in a neutral tone. "You can sort out the booking there." Avery nodded. "I understand," she replied. "I'll go with you." The way she spoke surprised both of them slightly. No resistance. No complaints. No anger. Just a calm cooperation, as if this were merely an unfortunate administrative procedure. But in Avery's mind, things were happening very differently. She knew that from the moment she stepped off the plane, the story had changed. It was no longer a small argument in the cabin. Now things were moving out of the gray area. There would be records. There would be reports. There would be questions. And when those questions arose, not everyone would be prepared with their answers. Behind her on the Falcon X-900, Captain Mark Holloway stood at the hatch watching. The lights reflected on his face, highlighting his stern features. He felt no remorse. Not yet. He was in the familiar state of mind of someone who believed he had just solved a problem. He went inside. "Close the doors," Holloway said to Emily Ross. "We're preparing for takeoff." Emily paused. "Captain," she whispered, "security is still outside. And that passenger." "She's no longer a passenger," Holloway interrupted. "She's been denied boarding. Note that." Emily bit her lip. She nodded, but her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the compartment door. She didn't dare look at Holloway any longer. Nor did she dare look outside where Avery stood under the cold light. Daniel Brooks stepped out of the cockpit. "Captain," he said, his voice low, "we should wait a little longer. This doesn't seem to be resolved yet." Holloway turned around, his eyes cold and sharp. "Mind your own business," he replied. "I'll mind mine." Daniel remained silent. Not because he agreed, but because he understood his limitations in that moment. He returned to the cockpit, his heart heavy. Outside, Avery and the two security guards were halfway to the train station. A small patrol car sped along behind its lights off, but its mere presence sent a message. This was no longer just support. This was a situation being documented. Avery heard the crackling sound of the walkie-talkie. Short, disjointed conversations. There was a request from the crew. The passenger was uncooperative. There was no violence yet. Familiar phrases. Words used to flatten a complex story, transforming it into a series of emotionless events. Avery didn't interfere. She walked steadily. In her mind, a part was memorizing every detail. Not for revenge, but because she knew that the truth often lay in the small details that people thought no one would notice. As they approached the station, the glass reflected Avery's image. A black woman in a simple coat, her hair neatly tied back, stood between two security guards. The image reminded her of another scene many years earlier, when she had been asked to leave an upscale store for not fitting the target clientele. She left that day, without saying a word, without making a fuss, and for a long time afterward she still remembered that feeling. Not because of shame, but because of helplessness. Tonight, she no longer felt that sense of helplessness, just a calm waiting. Inside the station, the lighting was warmer. There was the smell of coffee. A few night shift staff members looked up when they saw Avery enter with security. Their gazes were curious, then quickly turned away. A night shift manager came out. "What's wrong?" he asked. "The passenger has been denied boarding," a security officer replied. "At the captain's request." The manager looked at Avery. "Do you have any identification?" he asked. Avery took out her wallet and showed him her ID card. He looked at it, nodded, and then entered the information into the machine. "Would you like us to arrange another flight for you?" he asked, his voice polite but distant. "No need," Avery replied. "I just need a seat and a phone call." "The call?" he asked again. Avery nodded. "Yes," she said, "a call to the executive office." The manager hesitated slightly. Then he looked at security. A slight nod. There was no reason to refuse. "The phone is at the counter over there," he said. Avery walked to the counter. She picked up the receiver. Her hand was steady. Without hesitation, she turned her back to the room, standing facing the glass door overlooking the runway. The Falcon X900 was still there. The lights were on, but it hadn't started moving yet. She dialed the number. Not the familiar numbers in her personal contact list, but numbers she rarely uses. Numbers reserved for situations she hopes will never happen. The other end of the line rang. Once. Twice. Then, someone answered the phone. "North Meridian Holdings Operations Center," a deep male voice said. "This is the night shift room." Avery closed her eyes for a very brief second. Not because she was tired, but because she knew that from this moment on the wheels had begun to turn. "This is Avery Johnson," she said. "I'm at Hudson Executive Airfield. I need to confirm the status of Flight Falcon X900 tail number NX917. There was a very brief silence on the other end of the line. Very brief. But enough for Avery to realize something had changed. "Please wait a moment," the voice replied, more serious than before. Avery opened her eyes and looked out at the runway. The snow was still falling. The night was still quiet. But she sensed another current forming, silent but irreversible. In the cockpit of the Falcon X900, Daniel Brooks glanced at his watch. He sensed something was wrong, not with the technical aspects, but with the people. He recalled Avery's gaze as she disembarked. Not the look of a loser, the look of someone who had made a decision. Captain Holloway didn't think so. He sat in the driver's seat, buckled his seatbelt, and checked the parameters. Everything was okay. Everything was under control. He was unaware that on the other side of the airport, a call was quietly questioning the very power he believed to be untouchable. And as those questions began to be answered, none of them could have predicted what would happen next. Avery Johnson put the stethoscope down very slowly. The call just ended. No promises. No reassurance. Just a neutral standard response typical of those working within the system. "We are checking. Please wait." Wait. Avery was familiar with that word. She had waited her whole life for the answers others received instantly. But tonight the feeling of waiting was heavier than usual. Because this time, it wasn't just her honor that was hanging in the balance. It's everything. She turned around. The two security guards were still standing nearby. Their attitude had changed. No longer just surveillance, but vigilance, as if an invisible boundary had just been drawn and Avery was standing on the wrong side. "You need to stay here," someone said. The tone was polite, but it left no choice. How long? Avery asked. Until we receive further instructions. Avery nodded. She didn't argue. Not now. The night shift manager stood at the counter watching her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He was used to angry, shouting passengers demanding special privileges. But Avery was different. She did nothing. And that's what made things awkward for everyone. Outside through the glass, Avery watched the Falcon X900 begin to be towed away from its parking spot. The lights flickered. The engine started up deep and steady. A very familiar, beautiful sound, but tonight it carried the feeling of a door closing. She sensed it clearly. They're about to take off. A part of her tightened, not because she couldn't fly. She could call another one within hours. But because if that plane left, this story would be written differently, in a way she couldn't control. Daniel Brooks looked out the cockpit window. He saw Avery's blurry figure behind the station glass. An uneasy feeling crept into him. He didn't know why he cared so much about it. Perhaps it was because he knew deep down that what had just happened wasn't right. Captain Daniel said, trying to keep his voice normal. We haven't received final confirmation from the executive yet. Holloway didn't turn around. We have clearance, he replied. There's no reason to wait. But the passengers. No longer a passenger, Holloway interrupted. You heard me. Daniel was silent. His hands rested on the control panel, but his mind was elsewhere. He recalled Avery's gaze as she disembarked the plane. Not panicked, not desperate, rather, expectant, as if she knew something they didn't. In the station, another security officer appeared. This time, his attitude was stricter. Madam, he said to Avery, we need you to come with us to the next room. The room next door, Avery asked. It's just a formality, he replied. To clarify the situation, Avery looked around, eyes averted. No one spoke. No one objected. She realized how familiar this moment was. The moment when the system automatically shuts down and the person in the middle is pushed to the sidelines. She followed them. The room next door was small. Cold white fluorescent light. A metal table. 2 chairs. No windows. Nothing that suggested comfort. The door slammed shut behind it with a dry, sharp click. Avery sat down. A security guard stood opposite taking notes. Does she have a history of causing disturbances on other flights? He asked. That question made Avery pause for a very brief second. No, she replied, never. Did you use any drugs or drink alcohol tonight or not? Are you experiencing any psychological stress? Avery looked straight at him. Are you asking that because of what I did, she said, or because I didn't do what the captain asked? The security guard looked a little confused. He glanced down at the stack of papers. We were just following the procedure. Avery nodded. It was the same old routine. Thoughts began to clash in her mind. Part of her wondered, am I getting myself into bigger trouble? Another part reminded her, this is exactly how stories like this always unfold. You've become the problem, not because you did something wrong, but because you refuse to disappear. She thought of her mother. If she were here, what would she say? Perhaps she would take her hand and say, you're not wrong. But you need to know what you're doing. Avery knew exactly what he was doing. Outside, the sound of the Falcon X900 engines grew louder, then softer. Then it disappeared. The plane had taken off. A feeling of emptiness spread through Avery's chest. Not pain, but the stark realization that from this moment on she had truly been left out. One of the 2 security guards looked at his watch. We haven't received a response from management yet, he said. You'll have to wait. How long? Avery asked again. I don't know yet. She leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes for a moment. Is it worth it? Have I gone too far? Those questions have returned stronger than ever. No longer philosophical, but very practical, very human. If that call yields no results, if operations side with Captain, if everything ends here with a cold report that passenger was disruptive, then the price she pays will be significant. Reputation, time, energy, and even your own emotional security. Avery opened her eyes. She looked up at the ceiling. The light was a soft white. She remembered what her mother had said when she was a child. You can't control how others see you, but you can always choose how you stand. She took a deep breath. Slowly, then she exhaled. The door to the room opened. Another man entered. He was more formally dressed. The ID badge around his neck clearly indicated his title as Area Security Manager. Mrs. Avery Johnson, he asked. Yes. We just received a call, he said. From the management side. Tim, Avery's heart beat a little faster. But her face remained calm, and she asked. The man looked at her, his gaze unreadable. It seems he said slowly that we need to clarify a lot of things. Avery didn't answer, but deep inside something small stirred. Not hope, but confirmation that she hadn't been completely abandoned. But she also knew that the worst was yet to come. The small room fell silent. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but a silence that made one aware of their own breath. Fluorescent lights shone down on the metal table, creating a cold, luminous streak. Avery Johnson sat still in her chair, her hands resting neatly on her lap, her back straight. She didn't look at anyone. She gazed into the space in front of her where thoughts slowly drifted through her mind. The area security manager just stepped outside after that ambiguous remark. We need to clarify a lot of things. The door closed. The sound of the lock clicking was soft but distinct. Avery didn't move. She was used to moments like these. Moments when no one said anything, but everyone was waiting. Waiting for a decision. Waiting for a signal. Waiting for a turn of events that no one could have predicted. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Slowly, steadily, as if the world didn't know or didn't care that in a small room at Hudson Executive Airfield, an invisible boundary was being redrawn. One of the two security officers leaned against the wall, arms crossed. The other sat opposite Avery, but asked no further questions. They had asked enough. They had taken enough notes. Now, everything was no longer in their hands. Avery realized that very clearly. She thought of the Falcon X900 that had just taken off. She thought of the sound of the engines fading into the distance. A part of her still felt regret, not because of the flight, but because of how easily things could have ended if Holloway had chosen a different path. But people rarely choose the easiest path for others. In the cockpit tens of thousands of feet above the ground, Daniel Brooks sat upright, his eyes fixed on the control panel. The flight was proceeding normally. All the parameters were fine. But in his mind, the image of Avery standing under the airport lights kept appearing clearer than the numbers before him. Daniel Holloway said in a flat tone, "Concentrate." "Yes," Captain Daniel replied. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something very wrong. Not technically wrong, but human wrong. Holloway, however, disagreed completely. He settled back into his familiar seat, buckled his seatbelt, and adjusted his headphones. For him, the problem was solved. A disruptive passenger had been removed. The schedule was maintained. Authority was asserted. He didn't realize that his own overconfidence was causing him to overlook even the smallest signals. At Hudson Executive Airfield in the security room, the phone started ringing. The area security manager returned carrying a stack of papers. He looked at Avery, his gaze no longer cold as before. Not exactly warm either. Rather, it was cautious. "Miss Avery," he said. "I need to confirm some information." Avery nodded. "What connection do you have to North Meridian Holdings?" he asked. "I am the CEO," Avery replied. Her voice was calm, as if she were stating the obvious. The man paused writing for a very brief second. "CEO?" he asked again. "Yes." He looked at Avery for longer. It was no longer a judgmental look. Rather, it was the look of someone rearranging their assumptions. "And the Falcon X900 flight tonight," he continued, "what authority do you have over it?" Avery didn't answer immediately. It wasn't because she was hesitating. It was because she was choosing how to speak. "That flight," she said slowly, "was chartered through a subsidiary of North Meridian." The security manager took a shallow breath. He nodded, making further notes. "We've just received a verification request from the airline's management," he said. "And from the legal department of your company." Avery raised her eyebrows slightly. "Really?" "Yes," he replied. "They requested that all reports relating to Captain Mark Holloway and his crew be temporarily withheld." The room seemed to fall silent. The two security guards looked at each other. One of them shifted slightly, as if wanting to ask something but then stopped. Avery sensed a different atmosphere creeping in. It was no longer suspicion directed at her, but rather wariness directed at those who were certain of their power. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. In moments like these, silence is the best option. The security manager stood up. "You can stay here a little longer," he said. We're waiting for further instructions. How long, Avery? Asked, her voice still even. I don't know, he admitted, but things are changing. Avery nodded. As he left, she leaned back slightly in her chair. Not because she was tired, but because she realized she had crossed a point of no return. It was no longer a personal matter between her and Holloway. No longer a minor incident on Christmas Eve. Now, the system has been awakened. And once the system starts asking questions, no one is allowed to answer based on emotion anymore. Avery thought of Holloway. She thought of the way he stood with his arms crossed, giving orders convinced he was right. She felt no satisfaction, no anger, only a quiet sadness, because she knew many people were like him, not bad, but used to not being scrutinized. She looked up at the wall clock. It was almost midnight. Christmas was just minutes away. The phone in the room rang again. This time, the security manager returned very quickly. In his hand was a different phone, not a landline, but an internal telephone with a coiled cord. Mrs. Avery, he said, his voice lower. Someone wants to speak to you directly. Avery stood up. Who is it? She asked. The man looked at her, his gaze a mixture of respect and caution. The senior management team, he said. And the flight owner's representatives. Avery stepped forward. She picked up the stethoscope. In that moment, she could clearly feel her own heartbeat. Not fast, not erratic, but steady. This is Avery Johnson, she said. On the other end of the line, a deep, clear voice rang out. Miss Johnson, the voice said. We apologize for the delay. It appears a serious mistake has occurred tonight. Avery closed her eyes for a very brief second, not because she felt relieved, but because she knew that statement was just the beginning. We need you to confirm something, the voice continued. Are you the one who signed the contract to lease the Falcon X900 for this flight? Avery opened her eyes. Yes, she said. It was me. There was a very long silence on the other end of the line, longer than any silence before. Then the voice rang out slowly, heavily. Well, then, he said, we think Captain Holloway made a very bad decision. Avery didn't reply immediately. She looked out the window, where the snow continued to fall steadily. Christmas Eve was entering a new chapter. She knew that after this silence, there would be no turning back. The truth had begun to speak for itself, and when it spoke, no one could pretend not to hear. Avery Johnson held the stethoscope in his hand. The voice on the other end of the line wasn't loud or hurried, but it carried a weight that only emerges when someone is forced to admit an undeniable mistake. Miss Johnson, the man continued, we need to double-check to avoid any misunderstandings. Avery stood tall. Her shoulders were relaxed. She didn't lean on the table. She didn't lean on the chair. She stood like someone accustomed to taking responsibility for major decisions. She is Avery Johnson, the voice said slowly, CEO of North Meridian Holdings. Yes, Avery replied. And she was the one who signed the approval for the Falcon X900 lease for tonight's flight. Correct? She also had ultimate authority over the assignment of the flight crew, including Captain Mark Holloway. Avery was silent for a second. Legally, she said, that's correct. On the other end of the line, there was the sound of paper being turned. There was a soft sigh, as if someone had just realized that their initial assumptions were completely wrong. We're sorry, the man said. This time, his voice was lower. For what you had to go through tonight. Avery closed her eyes for a very brief moment. Not out of relief, not out of schadenfreude, but because she knew this apology wasn't just for her. It was for a system that had just been forced to examine itself. An apology is necessary, Avery said. But what's more important is what happens next. There was a brief silence. We agree, the man replied. And so, we've made some provisional decisions. Avery listened. Without interrupting. Falcon X900 flight has been ordered to turn back, he said. The crew will be detained for questioning. Avery opened her eyes. Turn around, she asked. Yes, the voice confirmed. We've contacted air traffic control. The plane will land at the nearest airport and return to Hudson. Avery said nothing for a few seconds. In her mind, the image of Holloway sitting in the cockpit was vivid. That man at this moment probably still believed it was all over. That he had won. That the plane was taking him away from a minor problem. She exhaled, slowly. And what about Captain Holloway? She asked. He will be asked to temporarily leave the cockpit when the plane lands, the voice replied. Until the investigation is complete. Avery nodded even though he knew the other person couldn't see him. And airport security, she asked further. They have been informed, he said. She is not being detained on any charges. On the contrary, we need her cooperation as an affected party. Avery put the receiver down. The room was the same. White lights, a metal table, 2 chairs. But the atmosphere was different, more distinct, lighter in a very subtle way. The area security manager walked in, his expression much more serious than before. Miss Johnson, he said, we've just received confirmation from the executive. Avery looked at him. Yes, she said. She is no longer being held, he continued. And we apologize for any inconvenience. Avery nodded. I understand, she replied. You're just following procedure. The man was slightly taken aback by that answer. Perhaps he had braced himself for anger, for demands, for reprimands. But Avery hadn't brought any of that with her. We'll arrange a private waiting room for you, he said, while you wait for your flight to return. No need, Avery replied. I want to stay here. Here, he asked again. Avery looked out the window. Out onto the runway, where the snow was still falling steadily. Yes, she said. I want to see everything put back in its proper place. The security manager nodded slowly. As you wish. Elsewhere in the night sky, Daniel Brooks received a message from air traffic control. He frowned. Captain Daniel said, we have new instructions. Holloway glanced over. What is it, he asked. We've been instructed to land at the nearest airport, Daniel replied, and return to Hudson. Holloway frowned. For what reason? Daniel swallowed. The operations requested it, he said. It relates to the previous passenger. Holloway smirked. Nonsense, he said. We've already settled that. Daniel didn't answer. He looked back at the control panel. Then, out the window. The sky was dark, silent, and unresponsive. Captain, he repeated, his voice firmer. This is an official order. Holloway was silent. For a very brief second, his eyes flickered. Not with fear, with discomfort. He wasn't used to being called back, not used to having his decisions questioned after they had been implemented. Okay, he said finally. Contact ATC. The Falcon X-900 began to change direction. At Hudson Executive Airfield, Avery rose from her seat. She walked out of the security room and down the terminal corridor. The eyes no longer avoided hers. They followed her, cautiously, curiously. There was even a vague sense of awe. She didn't respond. She didn't need it. Emily Ross stood at a nearby counter, her hands trembling slightly as she saw Avery approach. The young woman opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if unsure what to say. Avery stopped in front of her. Are you all right? Avery asked. Emily looked up surprised. Yes, she replied. I'm sorry for Avery, shook her head slightly. Don't apologize, she said. Remember how you felt tonight. And next time, if you can choose to stand on the right side. Emily nodded, her eyes reddening. Avery turned away. Out there, an airplane is turning around on Christmas night. Not because of the weather, not because of technical issues, but because of a truth that has been overlooked for far too long. And Avery Johnson knew this was just the beginning. Because the truth doesn't just need to be acknowledged. It needs to be pursued to its very end. Avery Johnson sat in the small waiting room, looking out at the runway. No longer detained, no longer questioned. But she didn't feel relieved. On the contrary, a very different feeling was developing. The feeling of someone who knows that when the truth begins to be drawn to light, it rarely stays where we think it will. Her phone vibrated gently. A short message from the legal department of North Meridian Holdings. We have begun reviewing all records related to the Falcon X-900 and its crew. There are some anomalies. Avery read each word slowly. Not surprising, but not pleasant either. She stood up and walked closer to the window. In the distance, the lights of an approaching aircraft could be seen. The Falcon X-900 was returning just as the operator had said. But in Avery's mind, that flight was no longer just a means of getting her home. It had become a link to bigger questions. In another control room, not far away, the screens were lighting up. A group of people sat around a table, stacks of electronic files in front of them. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed. This wasn't a routine meeting. This was a meeting where everyone understood that if they didn't face the truth now, the consequences would be far more severe later. We've checked Captain Mark Holloway's flight logs for the past 18 months, someone said. There are flights that don't match the official schedule. To what extent? Another person asked. Not insignificant, the first person replied. Some flights are labeled as technical transfers, but there's no corresponding maintenance required. Others use the aircraft for personal purposes, but the costs are allocated to the company account. The room was silent. Is anyone here to sign off on this? A voice called out from the back of the table. Yes, the other man said. It was Captain Holloway. And nobody checked. No one checked it again. Those four words hung in the air heavier than any accusation. On the plane, Daniel Brooks sensed the change before anyone said anything. The atmosphere in the cockpit was different, not because of the pressure, but because of an unnamed tension. ATC had instructed them to maintain a lower than normal altitude while awaiting further instructions. This wasn't a common occurrence. Daniel glanced at Holloway. Captain, he said, we're being held back. Holloway didn't answer immediately. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Something's not right, Daniel added cautiously. Do you think? I don't know, Holloway snapped. This is politics. Daniel remained silent, but a feeling of unease welled up inside him. He had flown with Holloway long enough to know that when Holloway talked about politics, it usually meant he no longer understood the whole picture. At Hudson Executive Airfield, Avery received a second call. This time, it's not an apology. It's an announcement. Miss Johnson, the voice on the other end of the line said, we need your involvement as an authorized representative in reviewing some of the records related to this flight. Avery closed her eyes for a very brief second. Specifically, she asked. Specifically, Captain Holloway, the voice replied, and his use of the aircraft in unauthorized circumstances. Avery didn't seem surprised. I need to see the data, she said. All of it. We're getting ready, the other man replied. But there's a problem. What's the problem? There are indications that he's not the only one. Avery opened her eyes. What do you mean? It's possible, the voice slowed, that a culture of silence existed. A group of people who knew but didn't speak. Avery exhaled very slowly. That's what she's most worried about. It's not an individual abusing power. It's a system accustomed to going unquestioned. She thought of Emily Ross, of the way the young woman bowed her head, of Daniel Brooks, who had hesitated but didn't step forward, of the people caught in the middle, not exactly bad, but not safe enough to do the right thing either. We'll get to the bottom of this, Avery said. Her voice was low and firm. One person at a time. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Yes, the voice replied. We will follow your instructions. The call has ended. Avery stood still for a long time. Not to think, but to feel. She clearly sensed that from this moment on the story no longer revolved around her being treated unfairly. It had shifted to another level. The level of responsibility. Of choice. Of whether the system would correct itself or continue to conceal the truth. She heard the sound of airplane wheels touching the ground outside. The Falcon X-900 has landed. In the cockpit, Holloway took off his headphones and stood up. His movements were no longer as decisive as before. Not because of fear, but because he sensed something very clearly, that this time everything was no longer under his control. The compartment door opened. Security personnel stepped in. Not in a hurry. Not speaking loudly. But their eyes were different than before. More alert. More professional. And no longer showing deference. Captain Mark Holloway, someone said. We need you to come along to clarify some matters. About what? Holloway asked, trying to keep his voice calm. About many things, the other man replied. Not just about tonight's passengers. Holloway paused. Daniel Brooks stood behind him. He said nothing, but a heavy feeling welled up inside him. Not joy. Not sadness. Rather, the realization that a familiar order had just collapsed. At the station, Avery watched Holloway being led off. Not handcuffed. Not yet. But he was no longer as free as before. Their eyes met for a very brief moment. There was no challenge, no victory, only a heavy silence. Avery didn't smile, nor did she turn away quickly. She stood there, looking straight ahead, not to prove anything. But Holloway needed to understand that what he was facing wasn't the wrath of an individual, but the consequences of choices he had repeatedly made for too long. Avery turned his back and walked towards the control room. Ahead of her lay no longer a flight but a long process. A process that was quiet, undramatic, but would change many things. And in that moment, Avery Johnson understood more clearly than ever. Justice doesn't always come with a thunderbolt. Sometimes, it comes through files opened in silence. The control room at Hudson Executive Airfield was lit up all night. Not the warm golden light of Christmas, but a uniform cold white light shone down on the tense focused faces. On the large screen, hanging on the main wall, lines of data appeared. Flight time, destination, fuel cost, approval code. Everything was neatly arranged, so clear it was undeniable. Avery Johnson sat at the head of the table. Not the central seat according to protocol. Just the seat closest to the screen. She didn't request that seat, but everyone automatically left it empty. As if everyone understood that she was the one who needed the clearest view right now. "Let's begin," Avery said. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't commanding, but the room immediately fell silent. One person from the legal team stood up and took control of the screen. "This is Captain Mark Holloway's flight log for the past 18 months, he said. "We've cross-referenced it with maintenance records, scheduling, and financial approvals." Screen transition. Red lines began to appear. 32 flights were recorded as technical movements, he continued. But there were no corresponding maintenance requirements. Another person spoke up from the back of the table. "This means the plane was used for a different purpose." "Yes," the presenter replied, "and the costs for these flights are allocated to the general operating account." Nobody said anything. Avery stared at the screen, unblinking, emotionless. But inside, pieces were fitting together. Small details that no one had noticed before. Reports approved too easily. The repeated phrases, "everything is fine." "Was anyone else involved in this approval process?" Avery asked. A brief silence. "Yes," the presenter replied. "Some mid-level approvals. But the final signature is always Captain Holloway's." Avery nodded. "Continue," she said. The screen switches to a different section. "We've also reviewed the CVR and ATC recordings," the other person said, "including tonight's flight." Sound was emitted in the room. Captain Holloway's voice rang out clear and unmistakable. "That seat isn't for you. I decide who flies. She's a security risk." No one looked at Avery, but everyone could sense the heavy atmosphere in the room. That voice, once separated from the airplane cabin and placed in a neutral room, sounded completely different. It was no longer the voice of someone in charge. Instead, it was the voice of an abuser of power, accustomed to going unchallenged. "We have compared this statement," the presenter continued, "with current security procedures. There is no basis for considering Miss Johnson a risk." Avery looked up. "Have there been any reports of inappropriate behavior on my part?" she asked. "No," the other person replied. "There isn't any." Another person in the room let out a soft sigh. Across the hallway, Captain Mark Holloway sat alone in the security waiting area. No handcuffs. Not yet. But his coat had been pulled back. The insignia on his shoulder was still there, but it looked heavier than ever. He sat upright, his hands on his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor. Footsteps echoed. The door opened. Two people walked in. A legal representative. A senior executive. "Captain Holloway," the manager said. "We need to have a discussion." Holloway looked up. His gaze remained stern, but something had cracked within him. "What about the passengers tonight?" he asked. "Not only that," the other person replied. Holloway paused. "We've reviewed his record," the manager continued, "and there are serious violations." "What are you talking about?" Holloway asked, his voice beginning to strain. The lawyer placed a file on the table. "We're talking about the misuse of company assets," he said, "and about the abuse of power." Holloway looked at the file. He didn't open it, but he knew. He knew that if they had put it on the table, the story was no longer in doubt. "This is a witch hunt," Holloway said, trying to remain calm. "I've worked for this company for 30 years. That's precisely why," the manager replied. "We absolutely cannot ignore it." In the control room, Avery stood up. "We need to make this clear," she said, looking around. "This isn't about revenge, nor is it about emotions. This is about responsibility." All eyes were on her. When someone in a position of power believes they don't need to be checked, Avery continued, "The system will fail, and tonight it nearly failed." No one objected. "Captain Holloway," Avery said, his voice still calm, "didn't just mistreat me. He put the entire system at risk." The executive manager nodded. "We have made a decision," he said. Captain Mark Holloway will be suspended immediately pending the full results of the investigation. A soft sigh echoed through the room. Not relief, but acceptance. The crew involved, he continued, will be held individually accountable. Not for silent punishment, but to put an end to it. Avery looked down at the table, then looked up. I don't want anyone to be punished simply for being afraid, she said. But I want the system to change so they don't have to be afraid anymore. The atmosphere in the room calmed down in a very strange way. In the security waiting area, Holloway stood up when he heard the decision. You can't do that, he said. I'm the one responsible for safety. The manager looked straight at him. No, he replied. You use safety as an excuse. Holloway was silent. For the first time since it all began, he had no answer. Avery stood in the hallway, looking through the glass. She saw Holloway being led away. No handcuffs, no noise, just slow, heavy footsteps echoing in the wide space. Their eyes met once more. There were no victories. There were no grudges. Only one truth has been put in its proper place. Avery turned away. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Christmas Eve was strangely quiet, as if everything had just been cleansed. She knew this climax wasn't the end. It was just the point where the story had to change direction. Because after power collapses, the most important thing is not who falls, but who will step up and how will the system be rebuilt. Morning arrives very slowly at Hudson Executive Airfield. The sky was still gray. The snow had stopped falling, but a thin layer remained on the ground not yet melted. Christmas Eve had passed, leaving behind a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of the festivities, but the quiet after everything had been said. Avery Johnson stood by the window of the waiting room, a cup of hot coffee in her hand. She didn't drink it immediately. She just held it, letting the warmth spread through her palms. She had been awake almost all night, but didn't feel tired. What kept her awake wasn't caffeine, but the feeling that things were moving towards a very clear point. Behind her, the small meeting room was ready. No press, no cameras, no audience. Just those who needed to be there. The management, the legal team, flight safety representatives, and a few empty seats for those who wouldn't be appearing again. Avery entered the room. Everyone stood up instinctively. She subtly raised her hand to signal them to stand up. No need, she said. Let's begin. Her voice wasn't cold, but it wasn't intimate either. It was proper, appropriate for her role. The legal representative opened the thick file. Based on the results of the preliminary review, he said, we propose the following decisions. He read slowly and clearly, one item at a time. Captain Mark Holloway's employment contract has been terminated immediately. No one reacted. No one was surprised. His pilot's license will be reported to the FAA for consideration of suspension or revocation, depending on the outcome of the subsequent investigation. A few people in the room took a soft breath. This was no longer an internal matter. This was the end of a career. The cost associated with the misuse of the aircraft will be recovered, he continued, and forwarded to the legal department for processing. Avery sat upright listening. She didn't interrupt. She didn't adjust. This wasn't the time to personalize decisions. For other individuals involved, the representative said, we propose a classification of responsibilities. He looked down at the list. Those directly involved in or approving the violations will be subject to disciplinary action. A moment of silence. Those who know but don't have the final say will be reevaluated, retrained, and placed under supervision. Avery looked up. I want to say something here, she said. All eyes were on her. We don't build a good system by punishing fear, Avery said, his voice low. But we also cannot tolerate silence. She paused, allowing everyone to clearly understand each word. If someone remains silent out of fear of losing their job, that's the fault of the system, she continued. If someone remains silent for convenience, that's their personal responsibility. No one objected. The legal representative nodded. We will reflect that spirit in our final decision, he said. The meeting lasted another hour. No arguing, no raising voices, just questions, answers, and carefully recorded decisions. When everything was over, Avery stood up. Thank you, everyone, she said. We'll end here. Everyone left one by one. The meeting room gradually emptied. Only Avery remained seated for a moment. She looked at the empty chair at the end of the table. The chair Holloway should have been sitting in if things had unfolded differently. She didn't feel victorious. She just felt that order had been restored. Daniel Brooks was waiting in the hallway. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice slightly hesitant. Avery returned. "Daniel," she replied. I want to say," he hesitated. "I was silent last night, and I know that wasn't right." Avery looked at him. No reproach, no judgment. "Do you know why you're silent?" she asked. Daniel thought for a moment. "Because I'm scared," he said truthfully. "Scared of losing my job. Scared of being seen as a troublemaker." Avery nodded. "Then you're not a bad person," she said. "But from today onwards, you have a choice." Daniel looked up. "What choice?" "Choose who you will become within this system," Avery replied. "The one who knows but remains silent, or the one who speaks up at the right time." Daniel took a deep breath. "I want to do it right," he said. Avery smiled slightly, a very small smile. "Then let's start today," she said. In another corner of the airport, Captain Mark Holloway sat in a private lounge reserved for suspended personnel. No uniform. No insignia. Just a middle-aged man in a regular jacket. He stared at his hands for a long time. In his mind, the years of soaring through the air flashed before him. The times he received praise. The times he was trusted completely. And also the times very small when he crossed the line because no one said anything. He was used to not being asked questions. And now for the first time, all the questions are directed at him. No one shouted. No one insulted. No one sought revenge. Only cold, hard decisions documented in writing with clear signatures were made. That's what makes Holloway feel the most empty. The morning gradually brightened. Weak sunlight filtered through the thick clouds. Avery stepped out of the station. She took a deep breath of the cold air. She opened her phone. A text message from her mother in Chicago. "Are you okay?" Avery typed a reply. "I'm fine. I'll be home a little late." She looked up at the sky. Another flight was preparing to take off. Not a Falcon X-900, but it was enough to remind her that things were still running smoothly. Justice doesn't stop the world. It only adjusts the direction, and sometimes that's enough. 3 months have passed since Christmas Eve at Hudson Executive Airfield. There were no loud press releases. No sensational headlines in the mainstream media. To most of the world, the story never existed. But for those present that night, time hasn't erased the memory. It has only made things clearer, sharper, in very different ways. Avery Johnson returned to Chicago one early spring morning. The city was as familiar as ever. A cold wind from Lake Michigan blew through the long streets. The trees hadn't yet turned green again, but Avery felt something had changed within himself. Not because of power, but because of clarity. At North Meridian Holdings headquarters, everything seemed normal. Meetings, reports, strategic decisions. But at the top where Avery worked, a series of quiet changes were underway. The airline operations division has been restructured. No single person had absolute decision-making power. Every flight required at least 2 signatures for approval. A cross-checking system was implemented. Not because Avery didn't trust people, but because she understood that trust couldn't exist without a mechanism to protect it. During an internal meeting, Avery spoke very briefly. "We don't fix the system because one person made a mistake," she said. "We fix it so the next person doesn't have the chance to repeat that mistake." No one objected. Elsewhere, hundreds of miles away, Captain Mark Holloway is learning to live a new life. He no longer flies. His license is under review for a long-term suspension. The calls that used to pour in have gone silent. Those who used to call him Captain now just call him by his first name. Holloway rented a small apartment in the suburbs. Every morning he woke up early as usual, though, for no reason anymore. He made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the cars go by. Occasionally, he thinks about that Christmas night, not with the initial anger, but with a feeling difficult to name. Perhaps regret, perhaps confusion. He began to realize that for years, he had become accustomed to no one asking questions. And when the first question came, he had chosen to suppress it. Now there's no one left to crush. Holloway once thought he had lost everything because of a misunderstanding. But as time went on, he was forced to confront an even more unpleasant truth: that it wasn't Avery Johnson who brought him down. It was him. Emily Ross continues to work at Hudson Executive Airfield. But she was no longer the girl who would lower her head and avoid eye contact. After that night, Emily was called into a private meeting. not to be reprimanded, but to be questioned. "Why are you silent?" the manager asked. Emily answered truthfully. "Because I'm scared." No one laughed. No one blamed. She was retained. But she was also required to participate in a new training program, not just about flight safety, but about professional ethics, about how to speak up, about distinguishing between legitimate orders and abuse of power. Those lessons weren't pleasant. They forced Emily to reflect on herself. But each time she left the classroom, she felt a little lighter, as if she were learning to stand up straight day by day. Daniel Brooks is different. He was offered the temporary role of co-pilot for a new flight crew. Not a reward, a test. Daniel made it very clear during his conversation with the management team. "I remained silent," he said, "and I didn't want that to define who I am." Avery listened to a report about Daniel during a brief meeting. "He's capable," said one manager. "But more importantly, he's learned his lesson." Avery nodded. "Give him a chance," she said. "But don't give him power without responsibility." At North Meridian, cultural change doesn't come from big slogans. It comes from the small details. From who is invited into the meeting room. From who is asked for their opinion. From the fact that difficult questions are no longer seen as troublesome. One late afternoon, Avery sat alone in her office. Sunlight streamed through the large window. She looked down at the familiar city of Chicago. She thought about her journey. From a little girl who was told she didn't fit into a woman with the power to change the way a system operated. She doesn't see herself as an icon. She simply sees herself as someone who didn't turn her back when it was her turn to stand at the crossroads. Her phone rang. A short message from an unknown number. "Miss Johnson, I don't expect a reply. I just want to say, I was wrong." Avery stared at the screen for a long time. She knew who the message was from. She didn't answer immediately, not because she was angry, but because she was wondering what kind of answer was necessary. Finally, she put the phone down. Not every apology needs to be reciprocated to be meaningful. At Hudson Executive Airfield, the Falcon X-900 continues to fly, but with a new crew, with new procedures, with questions encouraged rather than suppressed. The people who worked there didn't talk much about that Christmas Eve, but they remembered. They remembered it very clearly. Time doesn't diminish the story. It only reveals who has changed and who hasn't. And Avery Johnson understood that the long-term consequences of justice are not the downfall of a person. Rather, it is the slow but steady maturation of an entire system. Avery Johnson woke up earlier than usual. Chicago was still half asleep. The high-rise buildings stood motionless under the pale sky. She opened the window, letting the cool breeze fill the apartment. The air carried the damp scent of Lake Michigan, familiar and real. She stood still for a few minutes, just to feel her own breath. 3 months have passed. 3 months had passed since Christmas Eve at Hudson Executive Airfield. 3 months since things took a different turn. Long enough time for the system to change, but not long enough for the aftershocks inside her to completely subside. Avery no longer dreams of the Falcon X-900. But sometimes, in the most ordinary moments, an old image reappears. Cold white lights. The sound of the engine fading into the distance. The moment she stands alone in an unwelcoming space, she doesn't call it trauma. She calls it a memory. One weekend morning, Avery drove to the suburbs. The lakeside road stretched out deserted. She didn't put on any music. She didn't make any calls. Just drove and thought. She thought about the question many people had asked her in different ways. Why didn't you speak up sooner? Why didn't you use your power from the start? Avery understood why they were asking. But the answer wasn't simple. Because if she had spoken up from the beginning, the story would have ended faster, more concisely. But it wouldn't have touched upon the crucial point. It would have simply been a misunderstanding handled internally, leaving no trace. And more importantly, it wouldn't give her the chance to see who she truly was in the moment she was pushed out. She pulled over in a small parking lot. She got out. The wind picked up. Avery pulled her coat tighter. She walked along the lakeshore, where the gray water reflected the sky. Here nobody knows who she is. Not a CEO. Not North Meridian Holdings. Just a woman walking alone on a cold morning. And it is in moments like these that Avery allows herself to fully experience it. She admitted to herself that the night had exhausted her. Not because of the confrontation, but because she had to remain calm while being accused of things that weren't her fault. She admitted that no matter how strong she is, There are times when she just wants to be believed instantly. She doesn't want to have to prove anything. She doesn't want to have to be patient. She wasn't ashamed of it. Because healing isn't about denying emotions. It's about allowing them to exist and then putting them in their proper place. That afternoon, Avery visited her mother. The small house in the suburbs of Chicago was as usual. Warm, tidy, smelling of tea and old wood. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, peeling an apple. "You've gotten thinner," she said without looking up. Avery smiled slightly. "Perhaps," she replied. The mother and daughter sat down. There was no rush, no barrage of questions, just a familiar presence enough to bring peace. After a while, her mother spoke up. "That night," she said slowly, "were you scared?" Avery was silent for a moment. "Yes," she said truthfully. "It's not that I'm afraid of them. It's that I'm afraid of myself. That I'll get so tired that I'll give up." Her mother nodded. "Fear isn't bad," she said. "Just don't let it decide for you." Avery looked at her mother's hands. The wrinkles, the small calluses. She thought about how many times her mother had remained silent to protect the family, and how many times that very silence had taught her to speak up when she could. "I don't want to be someone who's always fighting," Avery said softly. "I just want to live a normal life." Her mother put the knife down. "You've been living a normal life," she said. "It's just that life has put you in unusual places." That statement stayed with Avery for a long time. In the following days, she proactively reduced her workload. Not because she was weak, but because she understood that rebuilding her inner self also requires time and discipline, just like rebuilding a system. She began writing again. Not a report, but private thoughts. About feeling watched. About times she wondered if she was being too sensitive. About moments when she had to remind herself that respect is not something to beg for. Writing helps her organize things, not to forget, but to remember them in the right way. One evening, Avery received an email from Emily Ross. The email is short. It's not polished. "I just want to say that since that night, it was the first time I'd spoken up in an inappropriate situation. I was nervous, but I spoke, and everyone listened." Avery read the email twice. She didn't answer immediately, but she smiled. Elsewhere, Daniel Brooks submitted a short, informal report. "We've just updated the cockpit feedback process. There's an added step allowing the co-pilot to pause a decision if they feel morally unsafe." Avery nodded as she read. Those changes weren't noisy. No one called them a revolution. But Avery knew that it was these small changes that would last the longest. Night falls. Avery stood by her apartment window, watching the city lights. She thought of Holloway, not with anger, but with a necessary distance. She hoped he would learn something, but she also understood that not everyone chooses to change, and that's no longer in her hands. For Avery, healing wasn't about forgetting that Christmas night. It was about not letting it define her entire being. She's still the CEO, still the decision-maker. But now, she's also allowing herself to rest, to listen, to have moments of quiet, not to escape, but to stand stronger. Avery turned off the lights, getting ready for bed. In the quiet darkness, she knew she had come a long way. And though the road ahead still held many questions, she was no longer afraid of the crossroads. Because she learned one important thing: true strength doesn't lie in always standing tall. It lies in knowing when to stop to heal, and then moving forward with deeper inner strength. Spring arrives slowly in Chicago, but when it does, the city seems to breathe a long sigh of relief. The trees lining Michigan Avenue began to turn a light green. People walked faster, laughed more. Life went on as it always has. But there are stories, though not appearing on the front page, that quietly seep into the lives of many in ways no one could have predicted. Avery Johnson's story is one such example. It wasn't told as a scandal. There were no viral videos, no slogans. But in closed-door meetings and internal training sessions, in small conversations over coffee, people began mentioning Christmas Eve in Hudson as an example. This isn't an example of a powerful woman. It's an example of a boundary. At North Meridian Holdings, Avery didn't stand up and speak to the entire company. She didn't tell her story. She let the news system speak for itself. A professional ethics training session was conducted for the entire operations team. There were no pictures of Avery on the slides. Her name was not mentioned in the hypothetical scenario. Only open-ended questions. What would you do if a decision was legal but unfair? Would you remain silent out of fear or speak up at the risk? Those questions kept many people sitting in silence for a long time. A middle manager sent Avery a private email after the training session. I've worked for 15 years and never thought I had the right to overturn a decision from my superiors. Now I realize that right isn't a privilege. It's a responsibility. Avery read the email in silence. She didn't reply, but she saved it. At Hudson Executive Airfield, the impact is more apparent. The choir meetings began with a new question. Is there anything about today that's making you feel unwell? That question initially made many people uncomfortable. People weren't used to expressing their feelings in an environment that valued discipline and speed. But gradually, some people started speaking up. A young flight attendant spoke about being treated disrespectfully by passengers. A technician mentioned the pressure to bypass procedures to meet deadlines. There aren't always immediate solutions, but being able to speak out has changed the way people see each other. Emily Ross is one of the people who has changed the most. She didn't become a leader. There was no career leap. But during her shift, she started asking questions. Gently, at the right time, not confrontational, but not evasive either. A colleague once told her this in the break room. Emily, you've changed lately. Emily smiled, feeling a little embarrassed. Perhaps it's because I don't want to bow my head like before again. The statement wasn't loud, but it spread very quickly. Daniel Brooks was invited to join a small flight safety board that reviewed gray zone situations that didn't clearly violate regulations but showed signs of abuse of power or injustice. During the first meeting, Daniel spoke slowly. I used to think that silence was the way to keep myself safe. Now I understand that silence can also make the system less secure. No one laughed. No one objected. Outwardly, these changes go unnamed, but they create a different kind of flow. Avery realized this when she was invited to a small private panel discussion for CEOs in the transportation and technology sectors. No press, no live stream, just acquaintances sitting around a long table. One of them spoke up. Avery, I don't want to ask about the details, he said, but I do want to ask, how do you know when to stop and when to see it through? Avery thought for a moment. I don't know, she said truthfully. I just know I couldn't live with the choice of remaining silent at that moment. Another person nodded. We are reviewing our internal processes, she said, not because we're afraid of lawsuits, but because we don't want our system to harm innocent people. That statement caused the room to fall silent for a few seconds. That was the kind of silence Avery was familiar with. The silence of realization. One evening, Avery received a handwritten letter. No company name, no logo, just a white envelope. Inside was a short letter, the handwriting uneven. I don't know you, but I'm a black woman who works in transportation. Last week, for the first time, I said no when asked to do something I thought was wrong. I thought of your story. I wasn't fired. And I'm still here. Avery folded the letter and put it in the drawer. She didn't see it as a victory. She saw it as a reminder that sometimes the most important thing isn't how many great things you accomplish, but showing others that another option exists. The media finally began to touch upon the story, but not in the way Avery had seen it happen. No sensational headlines, no confrontations, just a lengthy analysis of power and silence in the modern workplace. Avery's name appears only once at the end as an example. She didn't read the whole article. She doesn't need it. Because for her, the real impact wasn't about being mentioned by name, but about the system starting to self-correct. One late afternoon, Avery walked along the Chicago River. The city was reflected on the water's surface. She thought about the journey of this story. It began with a wrong statement and ended with hundreds of right questions asked in different places. She realized that spreading the message isn't about making the story bigger, but about making it deeper so that everyone who reads it finds a part of themselves in it. Avery stopped and watched the water flow. She didn't know how far this story would go, but she knew it had gone far enough that it no longer belonged solely to her, and that for Avery Johnson is what means the most. 1 year later, Chicago entered winter very gently. The snow wasn't heavy. The wind wasn't too strong. The city seemed accustomed to its new rhythm. Avery Johnson stood by her office window, looking down at the bustling crowds below. She wasn't thinking about upcoming meetings, not about the strategy for the next quarter. In this moment, she was only thinking about time. Enough time has passed for things to settle down. Christmas Eve at Hudson Executive Airfield is no longer as vividly depicted as it once was. It's no longer a series of sharp events. It has become a subdued, quiet backdrop, shaping how Avery sees the world. She doesn't often recount that story. Not because she wants to forget it, but because she understands that some stories only need to be told at the right time to the right person. Avery left the office earlier than usual. It was already getting dark. She walked through the familiar streets, where the yellow streetlights reflected on the damp pavement. The small shops were beginning to hang up their holiday decorations. Christmas was almost here again. She stopped in front of a small cafe. It was her usual spot when she needed some quiet time. Avery ordered a hot coffee and sat in a corner near the window. From there, she could watch people pass by without anyone noticing. A middle-aged woman sat at the next table, speaking softly to her daughter who was about 20 years old. "You don't need to speak loudly," the mother said. "Just speak correctly." That remark made Avery smile slightly. She thought about all the people who had crossed her path. Those who had spoken up, those who had remained silent, those who had changed, and those who hadn't. She stopped judging them. Because Avery understands that everyone has their own unique journey filled with their own fears and courage. At Hudson Executive Airfield, the Falcon X-900 continued its regular flights. No one mentioned Captain Mark Holloway's name anymore. Not because they wanted to get rid of him, but because the system no longer revolved around one individual. Daniel Brooks is now a veteran co-pilot. He didn't become a hero, but he became someone his colleagues trusted when they needed to ask tough questions. Emily Ross is still a flight attendant, but during training sessions for new employees, she's often invited to share her story, not to recount the events of that night, but to talk about something simpler. There are times, Emily said, when you feel like speaking up is a small thing to do, but it's that small thing that can keep you from losing yourself. Avery heard about it in an internal report. She read it slowly. Then, she nodded. At North Meridian, Holdings change has become routine. It's no longer called reform. It's simply how things work. During a brief meeting, a young employee asked Avery a question. "What makes you most proud?" After all that, Avery thought for a long time. "It's not about the decisions that have been made," she said. "It's about the questions that people are no longer afraid to ask." That evening, Avery returned home. The apartment was quiet. She hung up her coat and switched on the small light. On the bookshelf, the handwritten letter she had received from the strange woman years ago still sat. She hadn't reread it, but she knew it was there. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat down in the armchair by the window. Outside, snow was beginning to fall gently. The snowflakes were small, quiet, and unhurried. Avery thought about the question that so many people had asked, though they hadn't put it into words. If she could go back to that night, would she do things differently? She asked herself that question many times, and the answer was always the same. Or not. It wasn't because things ended happily. It wasn't because she was right. It was because, in that moment, she chose to live true to what she believed in. And sometimes that's enough. Avery doesn't believe that one action can change the world. But she does believe that a timely action can change the way a person sees themselves. She believed that justice isn't always noisy. It can be very quiet, very slow. But when it comes from persistence, it leaves a lasting mark. The night was getting late. Avery turned off the lights, preparing to go to bed. Before closing out the day, she stood still for a moment, looking at her reflection in the window pane. It's no longer the image of a woman being asked to leave her seat. Nor is it the image of a victorious CEO. It's simply a person who has crossed a crossroads and hasn't turned back. Out there, the city still breathes. Flights still take off. News stories still begin. And somewhere, perhaps in another airplane cabin, in another boardroom, in a very ordinary situation, another black woman will be faced with a choice: silent or speak up. If this story leaves any lasting impression, Avery Johnson hopes it's not her name. Rather, it's the small, very real feeling that you are not alone in choosing to do the right thing. And sometimes, simply not taking a step back is enough to go a long way. Avery Johnson's story isn't a story of victory, but a story about how people confront themselves in their most difficult moments. The first lesson is simple. Silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just a way for injustice to persist and deepen. The second lesson is for all of us, especially those who have experienced many ups and downs. True power doesn't lie in titles, but in how we use our voice. Avery didn't need to shout. She didn't need to show off. She just needed to stand firm at the right time. And the most important lesson, speaking up isn't about winning against others, but about not losing yourself. Not everyone who speaks up can change the system. But every time you choose the right thing, you change yourself. Life doesn't always throw us into momentous situations. Sometimes it's just a wrong word, a dismissive glance, and a very small choice to remain silent or not. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it made you think or touched a memory, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that are very real, very true, and very human. We are not alone, and sometimes simply staying and listening is an act of courage.